Maya sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, staring out at the street below. The evening was quiet, unusually quiet for a Friday. Cars passed occasionally, people laughed in the distance, and the sun had begun to dip behind the row of apartment buildings across the street. Inside her apartment, however, the silence was heavier, almost suffocating. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and her own breathing, steady and rhythmic, yet filled with tension. 8 years of marriage had taught her many things: love, patience, compromise, but in recent months, something subtle had shifted. Not dramatically, not with fights or shouting matches, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel, her husband, the man she had chosen to spend her life with, seemed distant. Not cruelly distant, not intentionally neglectful, but distant all the same. He smiled, he nodded, he spoke when spoken to, but the spark, the effortless attention that had drawn her to him in the first place was gone. She remembered the early days vividly. The way his eyes would light up when she entered a room, the way he laughed at her quirks, the way he could hold a conversation that made her feel like the only person in the world. Those days felt like memories from a different lifetime. Their conversations were clipped, functional, practical. Did you pay the bills? Dinner's in the oven. Don't forget the meeting tomorrow. Polite, courteous, but empty. Maya hadn't wanted to admit it, not even to herself. But a persistent ache had begun to grow in her chest, a longing she couldn't shake. A quiet grief for a connection that seemed to be slipping away. She set down the cup and traced her fingers over its smooth surface, thinking about how carefully she had arranged her life. Their apartment was neat, organized, reflective of her careful planning. Flowers on the kitchen counter, a small stack of her favorite novels by the bed, candles she lit on weekends when she wanted to create warmth and comfort. Everything was beautiful, controlled, and combut. It felt like a stage set. It's polished and perfect on the outside, while inside the warmth had faded. Maya wondered when Daniel had started drifting and whether she had missed the signs. She had. Asked herself that countless times over the past months, replaying moments in her mind. The nights he came home late. The phone he always seemed to check. The way he seemed tired but never explained why. The subtle avoidance in his gaze when she looked for connection. Every answer seemed incomplete. She wanted to confront him, to demand explanations. But she didn't want an argument. She wanted understanding. She wanted him. It wasn't anger that drove her that evening, but a sense of urgency. Life was too short, she realized, to live next to someone who seemed to be present but was emotionally absent. She wanted to reclaim something, a simple moment of intimacy. It's a feeling of togetherness, a shared space where they could just exist together without distraction. Her mind wandered to small images from the past. The morning they had spent laughing over breakfast pancakes, his head tilted back as he tried to balance a syrup-covered fork. The time they had danced spontaneously in the living room while rain streaked the windows. The gentle brush of his hand on hers during late-night conversations. Those fleeting moments, once ordinary, now felt precious, almost fragile in her memory. That night she waited until Daniel returned. She heard his keys in the lock, the familiar jingle of the door opening, and the soft shuffle of his shoes as he stepped inside. He called out a tired, "Hey, Maya," and she looked up from the couch where she had been pretending to read a book. His smile was tired, polite, but not the one that used to reach his eyes and make her heart flutter. She realized she didn't want to confront him with anger or frustration. She wanted to reach him, to remind him of what they once were, to ask for just one small gift that might bring them back together. Daniel. She began softly, her voice carrying a nervous weight she hadn't intended. He looked at her, raising an eyebrow. She felt her pulse quicken, the words she had rehearsed suddenly feeling too fragile, too important to speak casually. "This weekend, I just want one evening with you. No phones, no work. Just us, like before." Daniel blinked, surprised. He wasn't angry, not at all. He smiled, a small, hesitant smile, the kind that made her stomach flutter. "One evening," he said, nodding. "Okay, just us." It was simple. It wasn't extravagant. She wasn't asking for grand gestures, for expensive gifts, or for a spontaneous trip. She only wanted time, attention, connection. And yet, as she heard his words, a strange mixture of hope and fear stirred in her chest. Hope that maybe he still cared, still wanted her. Fear that perhaps this promise would fade, just like everything else had over the years. The next few days were strange. Daniel went about his routine as usual, polite and functional. There was no dramatic buildup, no special preparations. Maya tried to imagine what the evening could be, crafting scenarios in her mind, them cooking together, laughing over clumsy attempts at recipes, sipping wine on the balcony as the city lights twinkled below, sharing memories and secrets they hadn't spoken aloud in months. Thought both excited and terrified her. She knew that in just a few days, one small request would put them at a crossroads. It was more than just an evening. It was a test of what they still were to each other, a measure of whether love had merely quieted or had disappeared altogether. On Friday morning, Maya woke early. The apartment was bathed in soft sunlight, and she moved around quietly, trying to make the space feel inviting, warm, intimate. She set out flowers on the dining table, placed candles on the coffee table, and arranged a small tray of fruits and snacks on the kitchen counter. She even picked up a book of poetry they had once read together, leaving it open on the couch. Everything was subtle, nothing overdone. She wanted to create an atmosphere, not a performance. As the hours passed, Maya found herself watching the clock more often than usual, wondering when Daniel would arrive home. Whether he would truly commit to this small but meaningful gesture? She found herself feeling a tension she hadn't realized she carried, an undercurrent of fear, anticipation, longing. She tried to distract herself by reading, but her mind wandered constantly. She thought about their first years together, the promises they had made in whispered conversations late at night, the laughter they had shared, the warmth that had drawn her to him. And now all of that felt delicate, fragile, like it could slip away in the blink of an eye. Finally, evening arrived. The sunlight dimmed, and the apartment took on a golden glow. Maya adjusted the cushions on the couch, lit a few candles, and glanced at the tray she had prepared. Her heart beat faster. Soon, Daniel would be home, and everything could either feel alive again or collapse quietly in the silence that had grown between them. She rehearsed what she might say, how she might ask him to stay present, how she might reconnect without blame, without anger. She wanted honesty, attention, presence, the kind of intimacy that required vulnerability and courage from both of them. The sound of keys in the lock finally startled her out of her reverie. Daniel stepped inside, carrying the weight of a long day on his shoulders. He smiled, a faint, tired smile, and set down his briefcase. "Hey," he said quietly. Maya looked up and felt a flutter of emotion she hadn't expected. The evening had begun. Time had slowed and yet raced forward, every second filled with the promise of what might come. She wanted to speak, to reach him, to ask him to forget everything else for just a little while. But she stopped, squiffed. She realized that words could wait. Presence could not. They stood in the living room, the quiet stretching between them. Maya felt her pulse quicken as she watched him, studying the familiar angles of his face. It's the way his hair fell across his forehead, the subtle lines that had appeared over the years. She remembered the day they had met, the excitement, the laughter, the certainty that they were meant to be together. Now she wanted that certainty again, not as a demand, not as a confrontation, but as a gentle invitation to reconnect, to remember the closeness they had once shared. She finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Tonight, let's just be us," she said. Daniel looked at her, the tired lines of his face softening. "Just us," he repeated, nodding. And in that simple moment, the air shifted slightly. Hope, fragile and tentative, began to weave itself into the space between them. She didn't know what the night would bring, whether it would repair what had been lost or reveal new distances. But she felt something stir inside her, a quiet courage, a willingness to try, a longing that refused to be ignored. Maya realized that this evening, this one simple request was not just about spending time together. It was about acknowledgement, attention, presence, and the courage to face what had been quietly slipping away for years. She felt a mix of nervous anticipation, fragile hope, and an ache of longing that she had kept buried beneath routines and polite conversations. This one request was small, almost trivial. Yet it carried the weight of everything she had been feeling, the longing, the fear, and the hope that they could find each other again. As the first shadows of night fell across the apartment, she took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, spurred to herself, "Please, let him see me. Let him see us." The quiet house seemed to hold its breath with her, waiting for Daniel's next move. The evening had begun, and with it, the fragile Dell. Maya had waited all day, her mind running in circles. She tried to stay busy, tidying the apartment, rearranging books, even folding laundry for the third time, but her thoughts kept returning to the evening ahead. Her heart carried a mixture of anticipation and quiet fear. Would Daniel really show up? Would this evening, the one she had longed for, imagined for weeks, turn out as she hoped? Or would it crumble before it even began? She had tried to prepare herself for disappointment. Yet nothing could fully shield her from the surge of emotion that rose in her chest. Whenever she thought about him walking through the door, the clock ticked on, each second slower than the last. She checked her phone repeatedly, half expecting a message from him. A running late text, an apology, anything. But there was nothing. The apartment felt unusually large, quiet, almost hollow, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Maya sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clenched in her lap, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She thought about their years together, about the laughter, the arguments, the quiet nights, the shared dreams. She remembered the early days of their relationship, the way he had looked at her as if she were the only person in the world, the way he had listened to her stories even when they seemed trivial, the way he had held her hand in crowded rooms, claiming a little space for just them. That was the Daniel she longed to see again. And she couldn't help but wonder if he even remembered that man anymore. For months, the distance had been creeping in like fog, subtle but persistent, wrapping around their lives, muting their conversations, softening the edges of their connection. And yet she had clung to hope, believing that one evening, one small gesture might awaken the closeness they once had. Evening deepened, the sky outside darkening to a soft navy blue, sprinkled with early stars. Maya's anticipation reached a peak as she glanced at the clock for what felt like the 100th time. She could hear the occasional car passing by, the distant chatter of people walking home, the faint rustle of leaves in the gentle wind, and then the sound of keys turning in the lock broke her thoughts. Her heart leaped. Finally, Daniel stepped inside, carrying the familiar weight of exhaustion. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his tie was loosened. He said softly, giving her a tired smile. Maya returned the smile, a fragile one that masked the storm of feelings inside her. She wanted to reach for him, to pull him close, to feel the warmth of his presence, yet she paused, unsure if this was the moment. Words seemed inadequate, gestures insufficient to express the longing and frustration she had carried for so long. Daniel set down his briefcase and removed his shoes. Moving about the apartment as if he were at home, he seemed polite, attentive. But something felt off. Maya's heart sank slightly. She had hoped for a shift, for a spark that might signal he was fully present, fully engaged, that he had remembered what she had asked for. But as she watched him, moving with habitual ease, checking his phone briefly before setting it down, answering a quick text with a polite, distracted nod, she felt a flicker of doubt. By the time dinner hour approached, she realized that Daniel had left again, citing an urgent work matter that required his attention immediately. Her chest tightened, a mix of frustration, hurt, and quiet resignation washing over her. She had expected him to honor this evening, this small request. Instead, it felt like history repeating itself, his priorities elsewhere. Her desire for closeness postponed. Maya took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't want to call or text, didn't want to nag or confront. She wanted to preserve the dignity of the moment, even if it meant quietly facing the disappointment alone. Feeling restless, she decided to leave the apartment. The streets were cool, the air fresh, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. From nearby gardens, she wandered aimlessly at first, allowing the movement to quiet her thoughts, to let the tension in her chest ease just slightly. Eventually, she found herself walking toward a small bookstore cafe she had discovered months earlier, a place that felt cozy, intimate, and full of gentle warmth. It was quiet, with low lighting and soft music in the background. Shelves lined, the walls filled with books that smelled faintly of paper and time. And there were small tables scattered throughout, each with its own little lamp casting a soft glow. Maya entered the cafe, seeking comfort in the familiar quiet. She ordered a cup of tea, her hands wrapping around the warm mug, the steam rising to her face. She took a seat near the window, watching the city lights flicker and reflect on the glass. For a while, she allowed herself to breathe, to enjoy the solitude, to lose herself in the rustle of pages and quiet conversations around her. But then something caught her attention, a familiar figure across the room. Her heart skipped a beat. Daniel, sitting at a table, relaxed, his posture open, engaged in conversation with another woman. He was laughing, leaning forward, eyes bright in a way she hadn't seen in months. The scene felt almost surreal, as if she were witnessing a memory from another life. He wasn't being rude or disrespectful, wasn't doing anything inappropriate. Yet the sight of him sharing his time, his energy, his smile with someone else stung deeply. Maya felt a rush of emotions, hurt, disbelief, longing, and a strange curiosity all at once. She remained seated, unsure whether to approach, to speak, to retreat. She didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to confront him publicly. She simply wanted to understand what she had been missing, what had changed in the space between them. The woman with him seemed attentive, smiling softly, listening to him in a way that Maya realized she hadn't felt in months. Daniel's laughter was unguarded, easy, warm. 'Twas the Daniel she remembered, the one she had fallen in love with, yet it belonged to someone else in this moment. The realization hit her hard. Emotional distance could feel like betrayal even without physical actions. She felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Maya walked out quietly, letting the door close gently behind her. The cool night air embraced her, but it did little to ease the ache in her chest. She wandered the streets, trying to process what she had just seen. Her mind raced with questions. Had he always been this way? Had she missed the signs? Or had the distance grown gradually, imperceptibly, until it was too late? She thought of the promise he had made this simple one evening together. It had been small, humble, a gesture that should have meant something. And yet the sight of him laughing, smiling, being fully present with someone else, shattered the fragile hope she had held on to. Maya realized that love was not just about presence, about shared space, or even about promises. It was about choice. It was about who you chose to give your attention to, who you chose to see, to listen to invest in emotionally. In that moment, she understood that Daniel's heart, or at least the part of it that had once belonged fully to her, was not entirely hers anymore. The realization was painful, sharp, but it was also clarifying. She didn't feel the need to accuse, to demand explanations, to confront him in anger. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. She would need to understand what this distance meant, not just for him, but for her, for them as she walked home under the city lights. Maya's thoughts were a whirlwind of reflection. She thought about their years together, the early excitement, the shared dreams, the laughter, and the quiet moments of tenderness that had built their foundation. And she realized that none of that was gone. It existed, buried beneath routines, responsibilities, and unspoken frustrations. But to revive it, to reclaim it, would require more than hope. It would require honesty, courage, and an acknowledgement of the truth they had both avoided for too long. Maya entered her apartment again, the familiar space now feeling different. She set down her bag, took a deep breath, and allowed herself to feel the raw mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Hurt, yes, but also clarity. Sadness, yes, but also a renewed sense of purpose. She understood now that the distance she had felt wasn't accidental. It had grown quietly, almost imperceptibly, shaped by choices, neglect, and unspoken needs. And now that she saw it clearly, she could no longer ignore it. She poured herself another cup of tea, wrapped her hands around the warm mug, and sat by the window again. The night was deep, stars twinkling softly above, the city humming quietly below. Maya knew that the coming days would be difficult. Conversations awaited, questions would need answers, and emotions would have to be faced with honesty and courage. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of resolve. She wasn't running from the truth, from the hurt, from the reality of what she had seen. She was ready to confront it, to understand it, to decide what her next steps would be. And in that quiet moment, as she sipped her tea and gazed at the city lights, Maya realized something else. Love, even when challenged, even when strained, was not gone. It was still there, fragile but present, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for care, waiting for the choice to be nurtured again or released. And that understanding, painful and gentle at the same time, was the first step toward the turning point that would come, the moment when everything would need to be faced and the path forward would finally become clear. The apartment was quiet when Maya returned that night. The city outside hummed softly with distant traffic and the occasional laughter drifting from neighboring buildings. But inside, the silence felt heavier, almost tangible. She set down her bag, removed her coat, and let her hands rest on the kitchen counter, feeling the warmth of the tiles beneath her fingers. The night had brought clarity, but it had also left her with a storm of thoughts and emotions she didn't yet know how to untangle. She thought about the cafe, about the way Daniel had laughed, the ease in his posture, the brightness in his eyes when he spoke with her presence missing. Every detail was seared into her memory, replaying over and over like a film she couldn't pause. It hurt, of course, but more than that, it awakened something she hadn't felt in months. Truth. Maya knew she couldn't continue to live in uncertainty. She couldn't ignore the quiet fractures in their marriage any longer. The longing, the absence, the subtle betrayals of attention, they were all real. And pretending they didn't exist would only delay the inevitable confrontation she had been avoiding. She moved to the living room, taking a deep breath as she sat on the edge of the couch. Hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly, and she realized how tightly she had been holding on to hope. Not the naive hope that everything would automatically be perfect again, but the fragile hope that Daniel might still be willing to see her, to choose her, to acknowledge what had been lost. When Daniel finally returned, much later than she had expected, his expression was weary, shoulders slumped under the weight of the day. He greeted her softly, "Hey," and she returned the greeting, a quiet smile playing on her lips, masking the tension beneath. Maya could feel the electric pull of unspoken words between them. She didn't rise to meet him, didn't reach for his hand, 'cause she needed him to meet her halfway, not with excuses, not with distraction, but with presence, honesty, and acknowledgement. They sat together in the living room, the faint glow of the lamp casting gentle shadows across the walls. Maya waited, heart pounding, every second stretching into eternity. She wanted to speak, but she knew words needed to carry weight, not desperation. Silence stretched between them, a delicate thread of tension, until finally she found her voice, calm but firm, carrying the gravity of months of unspoken longing. "When did you stop choosing me?" she asked. The question was simple, but it landed with the weight of truth. Daniel froze, the words catching him off guard. penetrating the habitual deflections and excuses he had relied on. He opened his mouth to speak, then paused, searching for words that would not feel inadequate. The question touched something deep inside him, a place he had ignored for too long. A truth he had buried under work, distraction, and unspoken desires. Maya watched him carefully. She didn't interrupt, didn't push, but allowed the silence to hold space for honesty. Her heart beat fast, not with fear alone, but with a mixture of hope and anticipation. This was the moment she realized where everything would be revealed, not through accusations or anger, but through vulnerability and acknowledgement. She had waited for this, needed this, and now that it had arrived, she could only hope he was ready to meet her halfway. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I don't know exactly when," he admitted. "It wasn't sudden. It was little things. The way I stopped noticing, the way I stopped listening. It's the way I began to take for granted that you'd always be here, waiting for me, loving me, no matter what. And I started looking for attention somewhere else. Not because I stopped loving you, Maya, but because I felt unseen. I felt invisible sometimes, even when you were right there." Maya listened, her chest tightening as each word sank in. The hurt was sharp, yes, but it was accompanied by understanding. She realized that love, even when present, could falter under neglect, under emotional distance. Under the quiet erosion of connection, the truth was painful, but it was also freeing. She didn't need to guess anymore. She didn't need to replay moments in her mind or wonder where she had gone wrong. The honesty was raw, unpolished, and reland. That was what she needed. Daniel continued, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I didn't plan to drift. I got caught up in work, in routine, in distractions, and somewhere along the way, I lost track of us. And then I met someone. Someone who reminded me of what I had been missing. Someone who listened, who noticed, who made me feel alive in small ways that I hadn't felt in a long time. But that doesn't mean I stopped caring about you. It doesn't feel fair to you or to us. That I didn't realize how much I needed to see you, truly see you, before it got this far." Maya felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that he was being honest, that he was acknowledging the emotional distance, the mistakes, the unspoken neglect. It's heartbreak that it had come to this, that the intimacy they had shared for years had eroded quietly, painfully, without dramatic confrontation, but through subtle neglect and avoidance. She realized that the love she felt for him was still there. But it had been tested, stretched, and challenged in ways she hadn't anticipated. She reached out slowly, placing her hand near his on the couch. Not touching yet, just signaling presence, openness, willingness. Daniel noticed the gesture and looked at her, eyes wide with a mixture of regret and hope. He reached for her hand, finally bridging the small gap between them. Their fingers intertwined, tentative, almost cautious, yet meaningful. It was a simple act, yet it carried the weight of months of longing, misunderstanding, quiet despair. Maya spoke then, her voice calm but infused with emotion. "Daniel, I don't want excuses. I want presence. I want honesty. I want us to see each other truly and not just go through the motions. Can we do that? Can we choose each other again?" Daniel nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Yes," he said, the word carrying a depth of sincerity that resonated in the quiet apartment. "I choose you. I've been blind to what matters most, but I see it now. I see you. I see us, and I don't want to let this go." For a long while they sat in silence, hands intertwined, hearts slowly sinking again. The apartment filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of the truths they had both avoided. It wasn't a resolution of all problems, nor a promise that life would suddenly be perfect. It was something more profound. It was recognition, honesty, and the deliberate choice to face the challenges together. It was the first step toward healing, toward reconnecting, toward nurturing the love that had never truly disappeared but had been hidden beneath routine, distraction, and unspoken needs. As the night deepened, Maya and Daniel spoke softly, sharing thoughts and fears, hopes and regrets. Each word, each confession, was a thread in the tapestry of their renewed understanding. They talked about the past, about what had gone wrong, about the moments of distance and misunderstanding, without blame, without anger. And they spoke about the future tentatively, carefully, but with a commitment to presence, attentiveness, and care. Maya realized that this turning point wasn't about a single evening, single conversation, or a single gesture. It was about the accumulation of small choices, small actions, and deliberate attention over time. Love required effort, recognition, and courage. It required being willing to face discomfort, to acknowledge mistakes, and to prioritize the emotional needs of the one you cared about. And in that moment, she understood that she and Daniel were choosing to do that, consciously and together. The hours passed unnoticed. The city outside continued its gentle hum, distant traffic fading and returning like waves on a shore. Inside, the apartment felt warmer, more alive, filled with quiet laughter, shared memories, and soft smiles. They talked until exhaustion began to weigh on them, until words slowed and silences became comfortable, filled not with distance but with understanding and connection, before finally retiring for the night. Maya and Daniel sat together on the couch, hands still intertwined. She rested her head on his shoulder and he leaned gently against her, feeling the weight of months of tension lift, if only slightly. There was no grand resolution, no miraculous fix, but there was acknowledgement, presence, and the first tentative steps toward rebuilding what had been quietly fractured. Maya understood then that love was resilient, not because it was flawless, but because it could endure honesty, vulnerability, and deliberate choice. She had asked for one small thing, single evening together, but what it brought was far greater. It brought clarity, it brought truth, and it brought the opportunity to choose each other, fully, consciously, and without pretense, as they finally rose to retire for the night. Maya felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in months. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, moments where old habits might tempt them to drift again. But she also felt hope, a quiet, steadfast hope, that love, when nurtured with presence and honesty, could survive neglect, distance, and even the quiet temptations of distraction. It wasn't the end of their story, but it was a profound turning point. Maya looked at Daniel, who was now preparing the bedroom for the night, and saw in his eyes a reflection of her own feelings: remorse, hope, and determination. She realized that this evening, this long-awaited confrontation and confession, had shifted something fundamental. They had faced the truths they had avoided for too long, and in doing so,